So welcome to the first Agora session of the summit. We are here with Dr. Fouad and Dr. Zard to talk about climate change, health, and also sort of some of the links to conflict that those both involve. So maybe as people are coming in and getting ready, we can go around and introduce the panelists, and it would be best for you to introduce yourselves since you... my name is Andrew Curry. I'm a journalist based in Berlin. I cover science and health and a variety of other things, mostly for U.S. media, including NPR and National Geographic. And I'm here to facilitate the conversation. So as we get started, I'll also be hoping that you contribute questions of your own, because you're the experts out there. Dr. Zard, maybe you can take a mic and...
Well, I'm Monette Zard. Hello, everyone. I'm the director of the Forced Migration and Health Program, which sits in the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University in the U.S. I'm delighted to be here. And my background is really as someone who's worked in policy and advocacy on forced migration issues for about 20 years, mostly field work mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and based out of the U.S., Geneva, and London. Thanks for coming.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Fouad, which is a very easy name, so you just remember in the first part. I'm professor of public health practice at the American University of Beirut. Also co-director of refugee health program there at the Global Health Institute at the university. My main focus is refugees' health, conflict and health, and the health system in conflict settings. Good to see you all here. Thank you.
Maybe, Dr. Zard, you can start by setting the stage a little bit. You mentioned data when we were talking earlier. What do we know about the links between climate change, climate breakdown, and the increase in forced migration around the world? First of all, in terms of numbers and scope, and then also what are the proven links between those issues and health?
Right. Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, in terms of setting the scene, I think, as we probably all already know, we're already living with the effects of climate change on forced migration, and we've seen drought and floods and hurricanes already precipitate movement around the world. And last year, the estimates were that, sudden onset disasters like wildfires and floods probably caused the movement of about 18 million people. And slow onset events like drought have probably precipitated about, just over 1 million people to move during the same period. So we're already, I think, experiencing the changing environment in terms of the impact on human movement. But I do think one of the important things to bear in mind is that human beings have always moved in response to changes in their environment. And in many ways, migration is a kind of adaptation and a very rational response to the changing climate. But having said that, I think the science and the predictions suggest that human-induced climate change is going to intensify forced displacement, and it's going to change the pattern of some of those movements. By exactly how much, it's really hard to say, and you'll see that I've been hedging the numbers quite a bit, and you see estimates range from anywhere from 25 million people forcibly displaced because of climate between now and 2050 to up to 1 billion. Part of the reason why it's so hard to come up with a definitive number is that there's a lot of discussion and debate around causation, because we know that climate and environment interacts with conflict, poverty, and many other variables to precipitate movement. We don't really understand enough about people's resilience and what pushes one person to move and has another person stay. But what we do know is that climate will serve as a sort of threat multiplier. It will increase vulnerabilities. And I think Professor Fouad will talk a little bit about the interaction with conflict, specifically where we are seeing already, some of the highest numbers of forced migration on record. The final thing I just wanted to say on data is I think we have to be really careful about numbers and how we use them, because I think in an effort to try and get attention paid by policymakers to climate change, we talk about these massive numbers of people on the move. And in a way, we almost posit it as a threat. If we don't deal with climate change, the masses are going to be at our doors and at our borders. And I think that really undermines the bigger question of how we respond, again, to what is a very rational human response to the changing environment, which is to move. So we want to build on resilience as opposed to precipitating fear on the part of governments that, if we don't deal with this issue, we're going to have, conflict, poverty at our doorstep. So I think I'll leave it there, if that's all right.
So do you mean build on resilience in terms of creating spaces and systems that let people stay where they are?
I think both. I think we need to both build in systems that allow people to adapt where they are, but we need to think about migration as an adaptive process. So rather than always dealing with it as a crisis, if we have a rational migration management system in place that allows people to come and go, then we build on that adaptive response as opposed to creating a system that only responds when movement is a symptom of a crisis.
And yet some changes will be permanent. I mean, if climate change proceeds in the sort of more pessimistic scenarios, then there will be places in the world that will be uninhabitable in 20 or 30 years. People aren't going to go back to those places.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And, there's going to be a need for some planned relocation of people. There's going to be areas affected by drought. But I think the central message that I would want to convey is that's a small part of a larger part of the movement that we're going to be seeing. And in fact, if we think about movement as happening over a period of decades, then if we actually create the systems that allow people to move as and when it makes sense for them, for their families, for their livelihoods, then we're not responding, at the moment when a crisis hits. We've got systems in place that allow people to adapt before the situation reaches crisis point. And people have always moved and always adapted their livelihoods to suit the changing environment. We just need to make it a more seamless process as climate change adds to that need.
I hope we can come back to some ideas you have for creating those systems.
Sure.
But on the topic of crisis, maybe the ultimate crisis is conflict. And Dr. Fouad, as an introduction, maybe you can talk about what we know in terms of the links between climate and conflict.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, although I'm very tempted to comment on what Monette mentioned, which is very important, we need to think about this. Migration is adaptive mechanism, and this is not new. Since the dawn of history, people move for the same reason. Maybe we can see some escalate here in some crises, like a flood. Increase in almost 30 years. Increase the events of that. But also, this is not new. In history. So, and when people move, very small percentage come back, and that means we need to create a sort of system that can adapt with the issue of this sort of permanent, maybe, I don't know, permanent or semi-permanent, but we need to think about that. When people move, it's almost difficult to go back. And then, so how we can, build this system around the issue. Back to your question about the issue of, conflict, health, and climate change. This slide, this very complicated slide, is about the issue of the link between climate change and health, and you can see it's difficult to explain or to we can. So I simplified a bit that with the way that you can see it here. So we can see sort of direct impact on health, which is on the left side, and indirect through either the natural sources or the socio-economic, events, including conflict. And there's, of course, this context of that. I just put that very simple one about the link between climate change conflict and health impact. We know from the previous slide that climate change has a direct impact on health. Increased temperature, the issue of a natural disaster, all that lead to direct causes, including direct death, vector-controlled diseases, cardiovascular diseases, all these issues. But also climate change could lead, to sort of people that either move away, like a forced migration, or sort of direct conflict. And this is for example, the water conflict, water source conflict. So both actually has their own health impact. So when people move, the profile of health actually change and adapted to the new settings. So, and that's beside they come with their own health issues. I will give an example from Syrian refugees that move, to other settings. In Syria before crisis, the situation in terms of diseases, actually, 77% of people die because of chronic diseases. It's middle-income countries where this is a normal trend. And when they move with this profile. Climate change, the drought was one of these, among different factors or determinants of that. And when they move with this. But because of the situation of being forced migrants, the new diseases happen. Mental diseases are one of the major issues. The issue of, crowding. So start seeing diseases that, affected by having, increased people together. The issue of infectious disease that we start. So mixing their history of diseases with a new disease because of migration. To break out this issue of vicious cycle, I think we need to understand the entire dynamic of, what's the link between the different elements of this figure. I will stop here and keep it to...
So before we go on, are there any burning questions from the audience? I think people have had a chance to arrive. Maybe we can continue and talk a little bit about, you've talked about adaptation and systems. In the medium term, are we talking global governance? Is it more a change on the national level that should equip national governments to treat migrants differently? What are some of the systems and best practices that you can talk about?
Right, I can take a stab at that. So, the estimates that we have, when we talked about data earlier, is that the type of movement that we're going to see, mostly is going to be internal displacement. So people who move, but remain fundamentally within the borders of their own state. And so, obviously that means that the first point of call is always going to be the national government. And we do have some frameworks we can build on that grow out of the conflict arena. We have something called the IDP guiding principles, the internal displacement guiding principles, which were developed in the 1990s and 2000s that encapsulate best practice, build on existing laws and norms, and essentially provide a guide to states on how they could deal with disaster. And the IDP guiding principles explicitly talk about environment and environment in particular and disasters. So they're very adaptable to climate change type displacement. The second issue is what happens in the cross-border situation, where, again, obviously it's the nation-state that's the principal point of call. We have a system that's already set up to deal with conflict. We need to make that system work better. So rather than trying to avoid, obligations under the conflict and persecution frameworks that we already have, states really should be applying them as expansively as they can to deal with the fact that environment is a feature of a lot of the conflicts we see today. And then that leaves, the group who are cross-border migrants who potentially will not fall under the conflict or persecution framework of response. And there has been discussion about, do we need a new international convention to guide states to set some parameters for response? I happen to think that an international convention to deal with climate change-induced displacement is a recipe for inertia. It's where good ideas go to die, and we may end up for 20 years with nothing on the books. And I prefer rather the framework that has been used thus far by something called the Nansen process, which has tried to build on what states are already doing in terms of responding to disasters and outline a framework for what a response might look like. So, in brief, the Nansen process, which was a state-led process, found that already there are over 50 states in the world that are not returning migrants who've been displaced because of disasters, or find themselves outside of their countries but can't return because of disaster. So that's already being done. Let's build on that. There are already kind of frameworks in place that advocate for free movement of people, which again, rather than dealing with this as a kind of crisis situation, puts in place a framework so that people are able to come and go at least regionally without the need for visas, without barriers, which builds into the system some capacity to help people adapt and respond. So I think that's more the kind of recipe we should be using to respond to climate change displacement cross-border. Obviously, always thinking about how we improve our response to disasters as well. And there we have a toolbox that we already have developed over many years that we need to, frankly, make more effective to deal with the intensity of climate-induced displacement.
Do you have cause for optimism? I mean, an increase in the openness to cross-border movement and free movement of peoples, I feel like the political winds are blowing in the wrong direction on that front. It's nice to say, but is that really a realistic?
No. I mean, I have to say, you can't work on issues of forced displacement and be optimistic in the current state of the world today. It's really like battling uphill. But we have to look at the policy choices we have in front of us, and I see no appetite globally for a comprehensive global framework to deal with climate change-induced displacement. So that leaves us with, in a way, having to make the best of what we have and trying to persuade states that a lot of the tools are already in their toolbox, whether it's in terms of thinking regionally, whether it's in terms of using the tools they've already developed to deal with conflict, as a way of de-escalating the migration issue, because migration has become a real front line in terms of thinking around security and counterterrorism, and we need to go back to thinking about migration in a much more developmentally oriented, holistic way, and stop stigmatizing forced migrants and seeing them as a threat. So, I prefer to take a more incremental approach. I'm not optimistic, but I think we have to fight the good fight.
Can I have a comment here? Sorry to build on Monet's actually, but, I think the issue is not about, optimistic or pessimistic. I think it's just like a sort of reminder about these basic issues. We know climate change is not a purely natural issue. There's something, although there is natural problems, but there's something politics here. There's a lot of political issues, especially when talking about implementing something to mitigate the consequences of that. And that's linked also to forced migration, so we're linking to these issues. I will give an example here, about Yemen, which is, we all know about this situation in Yemen in the last years, maybe more than 2 or 3 decades, escalating in that. So water issue, water insecurity is very prominent in Yemen. This is a definition by international, organization about this water stress. Any amount under 1,700 of cubic meter per person per year could be considered water stress. And So in the U.S., actually, people consume more. They have like a 2,842 cubic meter per person per year. In the Middle East, actually is almost 1,000 cubic meter per person per year, less than the average, far away from the average, you know. And this is a major issue in the Middle East, thinking about the water policy in that, but also the global the issues on this. But look to the Yemen number. So it's only for 142 cubic meter. So it's very far away from, it's a natural disaster, but unfortunately dealt with a lot of politics there. So 70 to 80% of conflict in rural areas in Yemen in the last 40 years were because of the issue of water scarcity. So I think there is a need to think about, although we're talking about innovative approach, I think, but what we need to remind with the basic issue, without political willing to approach that in a very clear way, there is no way to solve neither the climate change nor with the issue of consequences like a forced migration and health impacts.
You put some slides up earlier that showed this incredibly complicated network of risk factors and how they impact on each other and how it's almost impossible to single out climate change as the one factor that contributes. Do you think it helps in this public policy debate to talk about climate change as a risk factor? Or is that, you mentioned as a recipe for inertia, in the debate, often climate change, people have trouble imagining how they can change that. It's such a global, huge problem. Does it contribute to the public health debate to portray climate change as a major risk factor that maybe an individual politician or an individual country feels helpless to change?
Yeah, there's an example from Syria when mentioning that drought is a major issue of the conflict that led, to all these consequences. I think there's sort of misleading here. Climate change is a major issue in Syria in the last, decades or more. But I think the issue, the policies that deal with the issue of climate change are a main cause, but that link to the politics, in the country more than the climate change, per se. This slide actually shows the link between, on the internal displaced population that mentioned by Monet. So we can see this in the blue, it's causes because of natural disasters, and in the pink with the conflict, armed conflict causes. And you see still people move internally because of flood, but immediately after that because of the armed conflict. So both actually are two major factors that influenced hugely by the issue of politics. And again, I want to stress on that. Without having this sort of political understanding of what's going on, nothing will be able to tackle with these issues in the near future.
Okay. In the spirit of the Agora, are there any comments from the audience? I think we have two microphones.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have one comment regarding IDB framework for this region, the Middle East, the MENA region. The situation is totally different than Africa and maybe other regions. There is no an IDB framework for this region, similarly to the African Convention that have contributed really to the IDB crisis. And I'm not sure when this is going to happen. That's number one. There were some advocacy at the level of World Humanitarian Summit as well as other kind of global frameworks, but it didn't really produce that much, even though we have seen the situation in Yemen, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and so on. The second thing is, unfortunately, those kind of global frameworks, one for climate change, one for disasters, one for health, one for this, for that, have created like a fragmented kind of governance, even though the crises are the same. And hence you do not have like an integrated kind of productive system that can really help addressing these kind of diverse issues. I'm not sure if there is any work that has been put in place for early warning in terms of conflicts or early warning in terms of the other crises that the colleagues have mentioned here. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, we can't speak about climate changes and the movement of people without speaking about politics. These are induced mainly by industrial countries, wealthy countries, who close their borders against immigrants, and they stop helping these immigrants to settle even in their bad situation in their countries. I think there should be a movement to let them pay back what they induce in the climate. And this is our target, to improve the situation of people who are under the stress and who moved from their countries because of these changes, that they are not controlling it.
Thank you very much. My name is Marian. I'm coming from the International Federation of Medical Students Associations. And I have two short comments. The first one relates to the political will you mentioned here. And as you may know, I would like to bring up the Global Compact for migrants, for migration. And you know that this compact somehow recognizes the environmental factors for migration, and it also brings up the need for policy coherence between different instruments, UNFCCC, Sendai, and SDGs. And I would like to know your reflections on the importance of Global Compact on migration in this discourse. And the second one, since I'm coming from the medical education background, and IFMSA really agrees with the importance of focusing on climate change and forced migration, and we've released our own initiative, which is called Vision 2020, when we want to have climate change-related curriculums in all the medical schools around the world. So this is my second question. What do you think about the importance of having climate change and forced migration in the education of future health professionals? Thank you.
As I am from an area that's suffering from conflict, from Syria, I want to stress that the most important and the major categories are affecting by this forced migration and forced displacement are children and women, especially when the regime, even they moved from area to more safer area, he targeted the health facilities, and that exaggerates the bad impact on Syrian, all Syria. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll tackle some of those questions as best I can. In terms of the IDP framework, I mean, you're absolutely right. In terms of the MENA region, there is nothing specific to the region to deal with IDPs. Having said that, the IDP guiding principles are supposed to be global in scope, and they draw as their inspiration international human rights and humanitarian law, which are supposed to be globally applicable. I would like to see some attention to the regional specificity, mostly because, it's important to dig down into the specifics of how these issues play out in different regions, but also as a sign that there's some political will to apply these frameworks, because that's where, we have, the biggest challenge, which is political will to apply what we have. But Africa has, in a way, set a standard through their Kampala Convention, which is the first regional law that really both specifically addresses internal displacement and climate change in that context. So, they're leading the way. I hope that this region can follow. In terms of carrying on with governance, the Global Compact, yes, that is an important initiative. It has, near universal, sign up, with the exception, of course, of the United States and Hungary, which are pretty large. And it is, an important document in that it does take a comprehensive approach to the environment, climate change, and brings, these issues together into a migration document for the first time, I think, in a comprehensive way. Again, the issue is going to be, can we translate that rhetoric into real commitments? And that goes to the environment around which we're seeing states approach migration policy. And thus far, I don't see much in the way of, I don't see I still see the challenges more than the opportunities. But I would rather have the global compact to work with than not have it. Let's put it that way. And it gives us a reason to organize and advocate over the coming years to make sure it's implemented. I think your initiative to mainstream some of these issues into medical students' curriculum is really important. Climate change is real. The health impacts are real. While we can talk about presentation and making sure that we're very cautious about how we talk about numbers and not play into the hands of people who want to close the doors to migrants by escalating or overly escalating the numbers. The reality is the numbers are there. We have to adapt to deal with increased migration because of climate change. So medical students are going to be the forefront of that. Restorative justice, I completely agree. It's a theme, and the place where climate change is going to be felt is not the regions of the world that have largely generated the problem. So this question of restorative justice in the climate change debate, I think, is a huge one, and one that we haven't really begun to tackle. I'll leave it there, and perhaps you could take up some of the other questions.
No, actually, I need to address several at the same time, if you don't mind. I mean, I totally agree the issue of the framework about, IDPs, and to link that with the issue of who pay the price. I think this is also, there should be a role for the region itself. Africa developed that, and also we can't blame others, that they don't have, they cause all these problems. I totally agree. But also what we can do is to build something also on a regional base. There's a huge need now to build something in MENA region, to think about how we can contribute more in the issue of the climate change, building sort of frameworks, but also building sort of regional, let's say, response to that. So in this case, I'm totally advocate for the issue to move from the national system into more regional system, if not global system. But at least we need to have something, beyond only national system. Otherwise, we will stuck with the issue that, the Syria government, the Syrian regime, as part of the conflict, actually, will, for sure, they will, be against, the issue of addressing people's needs. So health attack is one of the issue. But even with talking about the drought, it's, also as Syrians say, that drought in Syria is not purely natural issue. So there's sort of decades of bad policy for water, resources there. And that's issue of how to tackle, how to approach that in a sort of, broader way.
Hello? Yeah, hi. Can I just follow up on your point about politics? It's clear to most people here that there's without solving the political problem, we won't make progress on climate change and conflict. Given what we heard this morning from Professor Darzi about the reality of the political issues in the region. Given the reality of the political challenges in the region that we heard about this morning, what's the mechanism for finding a political solution by focusing on health in the region? I entirely agree with you on everything that you said this morning, but what's the mechanism in reality of achieving change and uniting around health to combat the effects of climate change and conflict?
Yes, hi. Coming from Athens, Greece. I'm with the world of emergency and disaster medicine more. And apart from politics, I come from Greece that accepted a lot of migrants, as you might know, with a lot of problems. But we nevertheless continue having an influx of migrants. Apart from politics, I'd like to discuss medicine. And the feeling is that somehow we compartmentalize between public health and disaster medicine. And we tend to have some issues left to public health and some issues to emergency and disaster medicine. And hearing about IFMSA, I'm very well aware that IFMSA has also a proposal for including disaster medicine into the curriculum of medical schools. And now I hear about climate change. Somehow we fail to interconnect those things. And this is not politics, this is medical issue that we need to address as the medical community. And I'd like your thoughts on that.
I agree. The issue, how to approach that from the issue of public health in a sort of broader understanding of public health that include medicine as a part of it. So I see public health as sort of an umbrella where medicine is part of that, or medical approach is part of that. So I totally agree that we need public health approach. But I would argue that this is also politics, This is a politics in a way or another. This is about how also we can understand the silos, being, having our own entity, our own protected zone, and also as physicians, I feel that this is also the problem that we don't open to, and that could also lead to your question about what can we do. I mean, from my point of view, myself, I think we should, as public health people, and again in this broader way, we should stop being very cautious about claiming that health is politics. We need to engage in such a sort of debate. We cannot say, of course, we need to be neutral in a way of thinking about how to approach issue, but we need to be more objective. And objectivity here means that we need to engage. Such a sort of political questions need from us to understand that and engage in that. We cannot keep claiming that we're not politicians, so we cannot engage in these questions. Climate change, conflict, and by the way, conflict is not emergency. Conflict is a context. We're talking about 26 years now as an average length of conflict. This is a generation. So we need to think about a context and curriculum, teaching, medical students, public health should engage in this as a context, not as an emergency medicine. This is not a temporary, by time actually, the issue of conflict become more and more longer. So thinking about that, I think if we put that as a sort of principle, we may be engaged more in this issue. Thank you.
I just want to thank you for that, but I have noticed that most of the discussion is to improve the situation for the refugee and other people who have found themselves in moving from their home countries to other countries, is to find solution from outside, or to try to provide the support only from outside. We also need to empower those people. As we do with any patient, as healthcare providers, we're trying to shift the responsibility to them, to any patient, to any person. He's responsible for his health with whatever resources he has or she has. They have to try to find, if we can support them emotionally, psychologically, with whatever resources we have, and let them know that they are still responsible for their well-being. They're still, with whatever they have, they can do a lot to their families, to their children, to whoever they provide care to. And they themselves, they can ask and seek for the help when they need it. They can identify their needs better than anyone else.
Well, I mean, I really just in closing wanted to build on that last comment, which I think is absolutely critical. I think, from the challenge that faces us all working at the global or at the regional level is to figure out how to empower people who know what they need to do to adapt to their changing environment. So what we need to do is to put in place the systems that can build on people's resilience, and work with them to figure out what option works best for their families, for them individually, for their communities as they have to change their life in response to the changing climate. And so that really goes to not thinking about these things as a crisis always, but thinking in advance, laying the groundwork that can allow people to move in their own time if they decide that's important. So that goes to the bigger question of how we manage migration globally. And I think we all have a role to play in working with our communities, working with our national governments, as well as regionally and globally, to kind of make sure that migration is regarded as a normal part of human existence rather than something to be feared always.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's totally important to engage people, which is, I think, the main issue is it's not just to understand, mentally and the psychosocial, but I think the issue for me, the legality, being legal, is one of the important issues. Most of those people, when they move, whether internally or externally, they are suffering from, having sort of legal status, and that will affect not just their, health situation, but also their existence sometimes, And that's, I think, I totally agree.
Thank you both for your thoughts, and to the audience for your great questions and attention.